He thought it was just another abandoned foal, but when this man opened the rusty cage to save the baby Mustang, he had no idea who was watching from the shadows. Because just moments later, the mother showed up, and what she did next left everyone absolutely stunned. This is a story about instinct, loyalty, and something no one expected. A wild horse's way of saying, "You saved my child. Now watch what I'll do for you." The sun had barely crested over the ridge when Jack Monroe's old pickup truck rumbled down a dirt road that twisted through the foothills of northern Nevada. The windows were rolled down, and the air smelled like dry sagebrush and pine, comforting scents for a man who preferred the wild to the city. Jack wasn't heading anywhere in particular that morning. That's how it always started. He called it wandering with purpose. Sometimes the land told you where to go, if you were quiet enough to listen. He'd been volunteering with a local wildlife group for the past 5 years, helping relocate deer and injured birds of prey. But what he found that day, wasn't a part of any call. He spotted it by accident. Just past a rocky bend tucked deep in a clearing lined with junipers, something glinted in the sunlight. At first, he thought it was a fallen sign or maybe a trap set for coyotes. But as he stepped out of the truck and approached slowly, the shape became clearer and far more disturbing. A rusted metal cage sat in the brush, crude, hand-welded, and too small for comfort. Inside it, curled into a ball of dust and trembling limbs, was a baby Mustang. Jack froze, heart thudding. The foal looked no more than a week or two old, tiny, malnourished, and covered in scratches. His chestnut coat was dulled with dirt, and his legs were tucked under him like he didn't have the strength to stand. His head twitched toward the sound of Jack's boots crunching the gravel. "Hey, buddy," Jack said softly, crouching a few feet from the cage. The foal flinched, but didn't cry. His dark eyes were wide with fear. Jack scanned the area. No tire tracks, no footprints, no sign of whoever had placed the cage here. It felt wrong. No, it was wrong. "What kind of sick?" Jack mumbled under his breath. He reached forward slowly, testing the cage. The door was wired shut, crudely, like someone didn't plan for it to be opened easily, but he always kept tools in his truck. 15 minutes later, after carefully cutting through the wire and pulling open the heavy latch, Jack knelt by the entrance. "It's okay now," he whispered. "You're safe." The foal didn't move, not until something stirred in the woods behind him. Jack's spine stiffened. A sound, low and steady, echoed from the trees. Not the crack of a branch or the shuffle of an animal. It was a breath, controlled, deep. He turned his head slowly, and there she was, the mother. She stood maybe 30 yards away, half hidden by brush, her powerful chestnut body poised like a statue. Her black mane caught the wind, and her dark eyes locked onto Jack, blazing with wildness, fury, and desperation. Jack didn't move. The foal let out the faintest whinny, almost like a question. And that was when the mare took a step forward. Jack's heart pounded. If she charged, he wouldn't stand a chance. She was pure muscle and instinct. But she didn't run. She didn't bolt. She just stood there, trembling. Not with fear, but with restraint. "She's been here the whole time," Jack whispered to himself, watching, waiting, too afraid to approach the cage, too wild to ask for help. And now she was watching him, carefully calculating every motion. Jack slowly stepped back from the cage and sat on a nearby log, hands open, eyes never leaving hers. "He's yours," he said quietly. The foal, after what felt like an eternity, unfolded his limbs and stumbled out of the cage on shaky legs. He stood wobbling in the sun, then let out a sharper cry. The mare answered with a whinny that made Jack's chest tighten. Then she came forward, and what she did next, Jack never could have expected. Jack didn't move. His hands were resting on his knees, fingers open, breathing slow, eyes locked on the wild Mustang mare as she stepped into the clearing. Each hoofbeat on the dry soil sent a tremor through the air, not of fear, but of fierce, controlled emotion. She wasn't running toward the foal. She wasn't even making a sound now. She was watching Jack. Every step forward was deliberate, guarded, but never uncertain. The foal, Dusty, stood just outside the cage, wobbling and weak, his thin legs trembling under the weight of his own body. He blinked at the sudden sunlight, ears twitching as he listened for her voice again. When she reached him, the mare exhaled slowly. Then she bent her head low and gently touched her muzzle to his shoulder. Jack couldn't help it. His eyes welled up. It was one of the most delicate gestures he'd ever seen, like she was checking to see if he was real. Dusty let out a breath and leaned into her. But then something unexpected happened. Instead of guiding the foal away, the mare turned her gaze back to Jack. Not aggressive, not fearful, just steady. And then she did something that made the hair rise on the back of his neck. She took a step toward him. Jack's heart thumped. "Easy," he said softly, not sure if he was speaking to her or to himself. But she wasn't charging. She wasn't warning him. She was closing the space between them, with Dusty limping behind her. Jack swallowed hard. Wild horses don't approach humans. Not like this, not when their foals are involved. Especially not a Mustang like her, born of open land and fierce bloodlines. But she was doing it. Slowly, thoughtfully. And then she stopped just a few feet away. The foal leaned against her front leg, visibly exhausted. He looked up at Jack, not with fear, but with something far more innocent. Trust. Jack's voice broke the silence. "You brought him to me." She didn't blink. Jack felt something deep shift in his chest. He had always believed in animal instinct. But this was something different. This was choice. She could have taken Dusty and disappeared into the trees. She could have waited until he left, then carried her foal away. But instead, she brought him out, right to Jack's feet. The realization hit him like a punch. She didn't just follow her foal. She led him here, on purpose. Dusty was dying in that cage. If Jack hadn't come along, if he hadn't opened it, and somehow, she knew he would. Jack slowly stood up. His boots crunched softly on the dirt, but the mare didn't flinch. He took one small step forward, then another. She didn't move. Jack crouched, holding a hand out low, not trying to touch her, just showing her that he meant no harm. The mare sniffed once, then turned her head toward Dusty. She gently nudged him forward. Jack watched in awe as the foal, shaky but determined, limped closer and pressed his tiny muzzle into Jack's hand. Emotion welled in his throat. "I've got you," he whispered. "I've got both of you now." The mare let out a deep breath through her nostrils, almost like relief. Then, finally, she turned and looked toward the open field beyond the clearing. A silent invitation. Jack blinked. "You want me to follow?" She stepped forward, slow and graceful, Dusty close at her side. And so he did. Not because he wanted to tame them, not because he thought he could keep them, but because they chose to trust him. And Jack Monroe wasn't about to break that trust. Jack walked behind them slowly, his steps careful and measured. He couldn't quite explain it. He wasn't leading the way. He was simply being allowed to follow. The mare, Sierra, as he had now decided to call her, moved with quiet strength, her head held high, her black mane flowing with the breeze. Dusty, the foal, limped closely at her side, his tiny hooves stumbling through the grass as the trio made their way out of the clearing and toward the valley beyond. Jack had rescued dozens of animals over the years, but this was different. He wasn't helping them, they were letting him in. By the time they reached the dirt road where Jack had parked, the sun had begun to dip low in the sky. A warm orange glow spread over the hills, casting long shadows and bathing the open land in soft light. Jack glanced at Sierra. "If you're planning on disappearing into the wild, this is your last chance," he said softly. But she didn't move. Instead, she stopped beside the truck, turned, and stood perfectly still, waiting. He opened the passenger side of the truck bed and gently lowered the tailgate. Dusty, clearly too weak to walk much further, was shaking with exhaustion. Jack approached carefully and knelt beside him. Sierra watched his every move, her muscles tense. "I'm not taking him away," Jack whispered, reaching into his jacket for a soft towel and a canteen of water. "I just want to help." The foal collapsed onto his side in the grass. Jack wet the towel and gently wiped the dust and sweat from the young horse's coat. Dusty let out a faint sigh. Jack looked up. "I need to get him to shelter, shade, food. He's not going to last the night like this." Sierra didn't flinch, but she didn't stop him either. So Jack did what he never thought he'd do. He lifted Dusty, carefully using both arms, and laid him softly in the bed of the truck, patting him with blankets he kept for rescues. The foal barely stirred. Jack turned to Sierra. "I'll take you both." He opened the side gate to the truck bed, but Sierra didn't climb in. Instead, she trotted a few feet away and stood at the edge of the gravel, eyes still locked on him. Jack read the message loud and clear. "I'll follow, but on my terms." So he nodded, climbed into the truck, and turned the ignition. Dusty stirred slightly in the back, his head resting on the folded towel. Jack looked into the rearview mirror. And there she was, Sierra trotting behind him, steady and unafraid, like she had done this before. The drive back to the sanctuary took nearly 45 minutes. Jack drove slower than usual, glancing into the mirror every couple of minutes just to make sure she was still there. And every time, she was, strong, silent, watching. By the time they reached the gates of the small ranch-style sanctuary Jack had helped build with other volunteers, the sky had turned a dusky pink. Lights flickered on inside the barn as Jack pulled into the drive. Dusty stirred but didn't rise. And as Jack stepped out of the truck, Sierra came to a halt just outside the open gate. The volunteers, 2 women and an older rancher named Hal, came out of the barn when they saw the truck. Jack raised a hand. "Don't startle her," he warned. Hal froze when he saw Sierra. "Jack, that's a wild mare." "She followed me," Jack said. "She watched me rescue her foal. She brought him to me." One of the women, Tanya, whispered, "And now she followed you home?" Jack nodded. "She's not here by accident." Everyone fell silent as Sierra stepped through at the gate on her own. No saddle, no rope, no coaxing, just choice. Jack gently lifted Dusty from the truck bed and carried him into a small quarantine stall lined with fresh straw, clean water, and a heat lamp. Sierra stood just outside the stall, watching, and when Jack gently laid Dusty down in the bedding, she let out a soft, low whinny, a sound filled with something almost human. Relief. By morning, word had spread. It wasn't every day that a wild Mustang mare willingly followed a man back to his sanctuary, especially not after trusting him with her newborn. Jack awoke before dawn, grabbed his jacket, and headed out to the barn. His boots crunched over the frost-kissed gravel as the first light of day spilled across the valley. Sierra hadn't moved from her post all night. She had stood just outside Dusty's stall, unmoving, her body a silent guardian over her weakened foal. The hay bales stacked behind her were untouched. She hadn't eaten. She hadn't slept. She had watched. Jack approached slowly. "You don't have to keep proving yourself, girl," he said quietly. "He's safe." Sierra flicked her ears at his voice, but didn't take her eyes off the stall. Inside, Dusty slept curled on a thick layer of straw, his breathing steadier than the day before. Jack had hand-fed him milk replacement, cleaned his wounds, and checked his temperature through the night. He wasn't out of danger yet, but he was fighting. And Sierra? She hadn't once tried to leave. She had chosen to stay. But not everyone thought that was a good thing. Around noon, Jack was working on repairs to one of the broken gates when a truck rumbled down the road. He looked up as dust kicked into the air. A black SUV pulled into the gravel lot. Two men stepped out, both wearing official badges clipped to their belts. U.S. Bureau of Land Management, one of them said. "You Jack Monroe?" Jack nodded cautiously, wiping his hands on a rag. "Yeah. What's this about?" "We received a report about a wild mare being held on private property. Unregistered, uncontained." "She's not being held," Jack replied. "She followed me, voluntarily." The younger of the two agents raised an eyebrow. "Wild Mustangs don't just follow people." Jack didn't flinch. "This one did." The older agent crossed his arms. "Even if she walked herself in, that animal is under federal protection. If she's unbranded, she's legally wild. That means she can't be kept on private land." "She's the mother of the foal I rescued," Jack said firmly, "and she hasn't left his side since." The men exchanged looks. "We'll need to see both animals." Jack nodded toward the barn. "She's right where she's been all night. But I'm telling you now, if you try to put a rope on her, things will go badly." They followed him to the barn, boots echoing across the wood planks. Dusty lifted his head when Jack entered, eyes brighter, a soft whinny escaping his lips, and just outside the stall stood Sierra, head high, muscles taut, eyes alert. The agents froze. "She's wild, all right," one muttered. "You can see it in her eyes." Sierra stepped slightly forward, blocking the stall with her body. Jack raised a hand. "Easy now." The agents tried to take a step closer. That's when Sierra reared. Not fully, just enough to send a clear message. Her front hooves struck the dirt with a thud. Her nostrils flared. Her eyes locked onto the men. She wasn't attacking, she was warning. The younger agent stepped back instinctively. Okay, point made." "She's not a threat," Jack said calmly. "She's a mother, and she doesn't trust you." "She shouldn't even trust you," the older agent shot back. "She didn't at first, but I didn't give her a reason not to." The younger one softened slightly. "So, what's your plan?" Jack looked through the stall window, watching Dusty rest his head on the hay. "I don't have one, except to let her stay until he's strong enough to survive. And then?" Jack's voice was quiet but firm. "Then she decides." The men exchanged another glance. The older one finally sighed. "You're not on record for harboring or selling. You're a licensed wildlife volunteer. We'll file a report, but for now, she stays. You keep us updated." They turned to leave. But before they reached the door, Sierra let out a deep, low nicker, soft and slow. It was not a threat. It was gratitude. And for a brief moment, even the federal agents paused, glancing back at her with something like respect. As the SUV drove away, Jack leaned on the stall door, watching Sierra settle down beside her foal, who curled against her belly like a child at home. "Don't worry," he whispered. They won't take you. Not while I'm breathing. The next few days passed in a strange rhythm, quiet, tender, and heavy with meaning. Sierra remained by Dusty's side without fail. She never tried to bolt, never acted out, and yet no one dared try to touch her. Her presence commanded space, as if the wild itself had taken a single shape and refused to be tamed. Jack kept his routine simple. Feed Dusty every 3 hours, clean his stall, refill the water, talk to Sierra like she was an old friend. She listened with those deep, knowing eyes. Every now and then, the sanctuary volunteers would stop by to offer help or simply to watch. Most of them couldn't believe the scene unfolding in front of them, a wild Mustang mare voluntarily living inside a sanctuary barn. She doesn't even have a halter, Tanya said one morning. She could break down that wall and leave any time. But she won't, Jack replied. She trusts you. Jack didn't answer, because deep down he was starting to feel it too, but something still nagged at him. Every time Sierra stepped into the light just right, something flashed beneath her mane. A darkened patch of hair near the base of her neck, just behind her left ear. At first he thought it was dirt or a scar. But today, as she shifted slightly while Dusty slept, the sunlight struck the spot again, and Jack caught a clearer view. He stepped closer, slowly, carefully. Sierra raised her head, but didn't back away. He crouched just outside the stall and leaned in to see more clearly. His breath caught in his throat. There, barely visible beneath years of growth and dust, was a faded freeze brand. Jack's heart skipped. Mustangs born in the wild are branded by the BLM before adoption. But this wasn't a recent mark. It was old, almost faded entirely. He stood quickly and rushed into the back office of the barn. Within minutes, he had pulled up the digital database used by adoption centers and sanctuaries. He typed in the partial numbers he could make out. What popped up made his knees go weak. File number 2875A, mare. Chestnut, black mane, born 12 years ago near Red Rock Range. Adopted at 1.5 years. Name at time of adoption, Sierra. Returned to wild after adopter was found guilty of abuse. Last seen, escaped holding facility. Assumed lost. Jack stared at the screen, blinking. He knew this horse. He didn't recognize her face, but he remembered the story. A young mare rescued, named Sierra, sent to a home that turned into a nightmare. Years later, she vanished during a failed relocation effort. Everyone thought she'd either died or been taken by poachers. But here she was, standing in his barn. Not just wild, a survivor. He printed the file and walked back to the stall. Sierra watched him closely. Jack crouched again, holding the paper low. "I know who you are," he said quietly. "You remember people, don't you?" Sierra didn't move, didn't blink. "You've been through hell," Jack whispered. "You don't trust easily. You had every reason to fear me. But you didn't." The mare exhaled slowly through her nostrils, lowering her head slightly. Jack rested the paper on the ground and leaned back. His voice cracked. "And somehow, you knew I'd help him." He glanced over at Dusty, curled up against his mother's side, breathing softly. "You've been protecting him all this time, but maybe you were protecting something else too." That night, Jack couldn't sleep. Not because he was worried, but because he couldn't stop thinking about the layers of memory buried in Sierra's eyes. She hadn't just found him. She'd chosen him. Maybe not just because of instinct, but because she remembered what it felt like to not be saved. And she wasn't going to let that happen to her foal. Not again. The storm rolled in fast. Not from the sky, but from the outside world. 3 days after Jack discovered Sierra's faded brand, the phone rang in the sanctuary office. Hal picked up. The color drained from his face. "What is it?" Jack asked, standing near the barn door. Hal covered the receiver. "BLM, they're coming back." Jack tensed. "Why?" "They pulled the brand record, found out she was supposed to be relocated years ago, said she's government property. They're sending a team tomorrow to take her and the foal." Jack felt like the air had been knocked from his lungs. "Over my dead body." He stormed out of the office and into the barn, fists clenched. Sierra lifted her head from the straw. She knew something had shifted. Dusty stirred beside her, still weak, but improving. Jack crouched beside the stall and pressed his forehead against the wood. "They're coming. I don't know how, but they found you." Sierra walked toward him. For the first time, she didn't hesitate. She stopped inches from his face. Her breath warmed his skin. "They think you don't belong to anyone," he whispered, "but they're wrong." That night, Jack didn't sleep. Instead, he wrote letters, emails, social media posts. He uploaded photos of Dusty's rescue, a video of Sierra standing guard beside him, a clip showing how she'd followed him home on her own, and then he told the truth about her history, her abuse, her escape, her survival, and how she'd made a choice, not to run from people again, but to protect her baby by trusting one man. He titled the post, "She saved him, now I'm trying to save her." He sent it to every animal advocacy group he knew. By morning, it had over 200,000 views. When the black government truck pulled into the sanctuary drive just after 9 a.m., it wasn't alone. There were other trucks already there, local news vans, animal rights groups, even a few ranchers who had read the post and come to support Jack. A woman in a blazer stepped out of the government vehicle, flanked by 2 agents. She didn't smile. "Mr. Monroe," she began, "that mare was declared federal property after her re-entry into the wild. She was marked for relocation. She was never meant to be here." "She didn't ask for any of that," Jack said, standing his ground. "She chose to come here, and I chose to give her sanctuary." The woman raised a folder. "This says otherwise. If you interfere with removal, you'll be in violation of federal code." But just then, a local reporter stepped forward. "Ma'am, are you aware this mare saved her foal by bringing him to this sanctuary? That she hasn't left his side since?" Another voice chimed in. "Are you planning to separate them after what they've been through?" More cameras clicked. Phones recorded. The agent shifted uncomfortably. "I have to follow the law," she muttered. A boy from the local school held up a hand-painted sign. "Let her stay." The agent's eyes flicked from Jack to Sierra to the growing crowd. Jack stepped forward, voice steady. "Look at her. Does that look like a horse asking to be relocated? Or a mother who found a place where she and her child are finally safe?" Sierra stood beside Dusty, her head low, eyes calm. Dusty looked up at her, nudging her side gently. The woman sighed. "I'll file a recommendation, temporary sanctuary status, pending review." Jack nodded slowly. "We'll take it." The agents left, so did the cameras, but Sierra stayed. Later that night, Jack sat by her stall, hand resting on Dusty's back. The foal had begun to nibble at hay again. His legs were steadier, his spirit stronger. "She came to save her baby," Jack whispered, "but I think she saved all of us." The following weeks unfolded like a dream that nobody wanted to wake up from. The storm had passed. Not just the legal one, but the years of fear, silence, and uncertainty that Sierra had carried with her. With Dusty now strong enough to walk, eat, and even play in short bursts, Jack could finally exhale without fear that everything might collapse again. Sierra had fully claimed the small pasture beside the barn. She knew every fence line, every gate, but she never tried to leave. Not once. Not even when the gate stood wide open in the morning sun. She had made her choice, and so had Jack. He expanded the shelter with Hal's help, adding a permanent open stall structure designed just for wild rescues. But it was more than a building. It was a quiet promise. You're safe here. No ropes, no trailers, just trust. Dusty grew fast. He would stumble after the barn cats or roll in the mud until he looked more like a dog than a horse, and Sierra watched him like a sentinel, but with gentleness in her eyes that no one had seen in the wild. The sanctuary received messages daily, donations, letters, drawings from school kids who had followed Sierra's story online. People started calling her the horse who chose a human, but Jack knew the truth was deeper than that. She had chosen forgiveness. One cool morning, Jack was in the barn stacking feed when he heard hooves behind him. He turned to see Dusty trotting inside, head high and tail swishing playfully. He paused just in front of Jack, snorting proudly. Then Sierra appeared behind him, calm, graceful, her eyes warm. Jack laughed and knelt. Well, look who's trouble today. Dusty nudged his shoulder and let out a soft, playful squeal. Jack looked up at Sierra. You know he's gonna outgrow both of us, right? She blinked slowly, then stepped closer than she ever had before. Jack held his breath. She lowered her head gently and, without fear, she pressed her forehead to his chest. For a moment, the world stopped. He closed his eyes and felt the warmth of her breath, the quiet pulse of her presence. There were no words to describe what passed between them in that moment. No saddle, no command, no ownership. Just two beings who had earned each other's trust. When he opened his eyes, there were tears. He whispered, "You're not just home, Sierra. You are home." Later that week, the Bureau returned, but not to take her. This time, it was a single official with a clipboard, escorted by the same young agent who had flinched when Sierra reared that first day. But now... He smiled. "I pushed your paperwork through," the young agent said, handing Jack a letter. "She's officially registered under sanctuary protection. Dusty, too. You won't be hearing from us again." Jack unfolded the paper with trembling hands. Sierra, Mustang mare, 12 years old. Dusty, foal, born in the wild, now protected under guardian status. Status, permanent residence, Carter Sanctuary. Jack didn't say a word, just nodded. As they walked back to their truck, the agent turned and looked at Sierra, who was grazing peacefully with Dusty in the pasture. "She's something else," he murmured. Jack smiled. "She's more than something. She's a miracle that decided to walk through my gate." That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in gold and lavender, Jack sat on the porch with a mug of coffee. Sierra and Dusty roamed the open pasture just beyond the fence, silhouetted by light. Tanya joined him with 2 mugs of cocoa. "Can you believe she stayed?" she asked softly. "I don't just believe it," Jack said, eyes still on the field. "I live by it now." They watched in silence as Dusty sprinted toward a cluster of trees, Sierra galloping just behind him, still fierce, still wild, but finally at peace. And Jack knew. This wasn't just a rescue story. It wasn't just about a foal in a cage or a mother watching from the shadows. It was about what happens when a wild heart learns to trust again, and in doing so, teaches a man to do the same. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to reflect. Would you have opened that cage? Would you have listened to what that wild mother was trying to say without words? Subscribe to the channel for more stories that prove the bond between animals and humans is deeper than we imagine. Leave a like if Sierra's journey moved you. Share this video with someone who believes in second chances, because sometimes the wild doesn't need to be tamed. It just needs to be understood.
A battle-worn Marine wandered into a dusty flea market one autumn afternoon, just looking for a wrench to fix his porch. But instead, he walked out with a limping German Shepherd for only $10. The seller said the dog was worthless, but the moment their eyes met, something unspoken passed between man and animal. He had no idea this was no ordinary stray. This was a decorated military K9, missing in action for 3 long years after a deadly explosion in Syria. How had this war hero crossed oceans, survived countless hands, and ended up waiting for him in a small-town market? What happened next will make you cry and believe in second chances again. Before we start, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. It was a crisp Saturday morning in Pine Hollow, a small town nestled between rolling hills and the slow bend of the Willow Creek. The air carried the scent of wood smoke from chimneys, and golden leaves chased one another across the cracked sidewalks. The sun was just warm enough to take the edge off the autumn chill, casting a gentle light over the weekly flea market that spread along Main Street. Mark Thompson, 42, moved slowly through the rows of stalls. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with weathered skin tanned by years under foreign suns. His dark brown hair was cut short, streaked faintly with silver at the temples, and his eyes, once sharp and quick, now carried the distant haze of someone who had seen too much. His movements had the careful precision of a man trained for discipline, but his gaze flicked about with a quiet vigilance that never truly left him. After serving over a decade as a U.S. Marine, 2 tours in Afghanistan and 1 in Iraq, Mark had been medically discharged following an IED explosion. He walked away with a limp, deep scars across his back and shoulders, and a constant companion he had never invited, post-traumatic stress disorder. Crowds were not his comfort zone anymore, but the flea market was different. The chatter here was low, punctuated by the creak of tables and the shuffle of boots on gravel. Today, he was looking for nothing more than an old wrench to fix his porch railing. As he turned down a narrow lane between vendors selling mismatched teacups and rusted farm tools, his gaze caught something that made him pause. Near the far edge of the market, next to a stall piled with dented oil cans, a length of frayed rope was tied loosely to a fence post. At the end of that rope sat a German Shepherd. The dog was thin, its ribs faintly visible under a patchy coat of tan and black. One hind leg favored the ground awkwardly, the paw turned slightly inward as though from an old injury. Mud clung to the matted fur around its haunches, and the left ear bore a small tear near the tip. Yet it was the eyes that made Mark stop, a deep amber gaze, steady and unflinching, meeting his without fear or pleading. Beside the dog stood its owner, a heavy-set man in a stained plaid jacket. His beard was unkempt, and his hands were stuffed into his pockets as though holding in the last scraps of patience. "You lookin'?" the man asked, his voice low and gravelly, tinged with the drawl of someone who'd lived here all his life. Mark stepped closer, his boots crunching against the grit. "What's the story?" he asked. The man shrugged, eyes already drifting away as though bored. "Ain't no story. Hurt his leg. Can't work no more. Eats too much. You want him? $10 and he's yours. Otherwise, he's going to the shelter Monday." The words settled heavily between them. Mark knew what shelter often meant for older, injured dogs in small towns, short stays, and quick endings. He looked again at the German Shepherd. The dog didn't shift or whine, didn't cower or pull back. It just sat, still and patient, like it had already accepted whatever fate came next. Mark felt something stir in his chest, a quiet recognition. In those eyes he saw the same dull edge he'd once seen in the mirror after coming home from war. He reached into the pocket of his worn jacket and pulled out a crumpled $10 bill. "I'll take him." The man grunted, snatched the bill and muttered, "Your problem now." Without another glance he turned back to his stall, already hawking a set of rusted fishing lures to the next passerby. Mark crouched slowly, careful not to startle the dog. "Hey, buddy," he said softly. His voice, naturally deep, took on a gentler tone he rarely used. He loosened the knot around the fence post, letting the frayed rope slip free. The dog's ears flicked forward slightly, but it didn't resist. It stood, a little unsteady, and stepped toward Mark with quiet obedience. For a moment they simply stood there, man and dog, amid the bustle of the market. The sun caught the amber in the dog's eyes, and Mark thought, without knowing why, Hunter. The name fit like it had been waiting for this moment. He led Hunter out of the market, their steps falling into an unspoken rhythm. The dog didn't pull against the rope or lag behind. He matched Mark's pace as though they'd walked together for years. On the way to his truck, Mark passed Sarah Johnson, the flea market's unofficial mayor. Sarah was in her late 50s, tall and wiry, with sharp blue eyes and a smile that could melt most people's defenses. She ran the coffee stand every Saturday and seemed to know everyone's business. "Morning, Mark," she called, spotting him. Her gaze dropped to Hunter. "And who's this fine fellow?" "Name's Hunter," Mark replied, testing the name out loud for the first time. Sarah's smile faded slightly as she took in the dog's thin frame and limping step. "Looks like he's had a rough go," she said gently. "Well, you're in good hands now, handsome." Mark gave her a small nod, appreciating the warmth in her tone, but not ready to linger in conversation. He opened the truck door, and Hunter hopped in with surprising ease for a dog with a limp, settling onto the seat as though it were already his. The drive home was quiet. The hum of the engine and the muted rush of wind through a cracked window filled the silence. Mark glanced over once or twice, half expecting Hunter to fidget, but the dog simply sat, gazing out at the passing trees. When they reached Mark's small, weathered farmhouse at the edge of town, the afternoon light had softened. He parked beside the old red barn, paint peeling in wide strips, and led Hunter toward the back. Inside the barn, the scent of hay and aged wood welcomed them. Mark spread a thick wool blanket in a corner, setting down a stainless steel bowl filled with fresh water. He found a dented food dish in the barn's cabinet and filled it with kibble he kept on hand for strays that sometimes wandered through. Hunter sniffed the food, but didn't eat right away. Instead, he lowered himself onto the blanket, curling slightly to rest the injured leg. His eyes followed Mark as he moved about, calm and watchful. Kneeling beside him, Mark reached out and stroked the coarse fur along his neck. "You're safe now, Hunter," he murmured. For a brief second, he thought he felt the dog's body relax under his hand. Outside, the wind rustled through the bare branches, and the distant call of a crow echoed over the fields. Inside the barn, man and dog shared a quiet stillness, both sensing that this, whatever it was the start of something neither had expected. The first night, Hunter didn't sleep much. Mark could hear the soft rustle of the wool blanket in the barn and the occasional scrape of claws against the wooden floorboards. The old farmhouse creaked in the cold, the sound carrying through the stillness like faint whispers. In the morning, frost dusted the grass outside, glinting pale gold in the first light. Mark stepped into the barn holding a dented coffee mug in one hand and a bowl of fresh water in the other. Hunter lay curled on the blanket, head lifting slightly as Mark entered. The dog's amber eyes met his, guarded but alert. He didn't growl, didn't wag his tail, just watched. Mark set the water down beside the half-full bowl of kibble from last night. "Morning, Hunter," he said in a low, steady voice. The dog sniffed at the water, but didn't drink. Mark knew better than to push. He'd been in that place himself, the one where hunger didn't matter as much as keeping your guard up. After pouring himself another cup of coffee, he pulled over a crate and sat across from the dog. He didn't reach for him or make sudden movements, he just sat there, sipping quietly, letting Hunter's gaze wander over him. Later that day, Mark carried a worn armchair from the house into the barn. He set it near the corner, far enough away so Hunter wouldn't feel crowded. From there, he read old paperbacks, the faint scent of tobacco clinging to the pages. Sometimes he spoke aloud, reading paragraphs in a slow, measured tone, just enough to fill the air with something gentle. Hunter's ears would flick now and then, as if considering whether the sound was worth paying attention to. On the third day, the weather shifted. A thin drizzle fell, tapping against the barn roof. Mark sat in his chair with a blanket over his lap, flipping through a book about woodworking. Sarah Johnson stopped by unannounced, holding a small paper bag. She had on a dark blue raincoat and a knitted scarf the color of wine, her tall frame casting a shadow across the barn doorway. Sarah had always been known for showing up when people least expected it. Widowed young when her husband died in a logging accident, she had since filled her life with town committees, church fundraisers, and making sure no neighbor went unnoticed. It gave her a sense of purpose that softened the sharp grief she'd carried for decades. "Thought I'd bring him something," she said, handing Mark the bag. Inside was a chunk of roasted chicken wrapped in wax paper. "Maybe he'll take to real food faster than dry kibble." "Thanks," Mark replied. He took the chicken, tore off a small piece, and placed it near Hunter's bowl. The dog sniffed at it cautiously, then glanced up at Mark. For a moment, neither moved. Finally, Hunter lowered his head and took the piece between his teeth, chewing slowly. Sarah's face lit up. "There's a start." Mark gave a short nod. "It's something." Over the next few days, Mark made it a habit to spend long stretches in the barn, whether fixing tools, oiling his rifle, or simply sitting in silence. He understood that for trust to grow, he had to be as consistent as the rising sun. He didn't force contact, he let Hunter choose when to close the gap. One evening, just before dusk, Mark sat cross-legged on the floor, cleaning an old lantern. Hunter was lying a few feet away, head resting on his paws. The barn smelled faintly of hay and motor oil. Mark hummed without realizing it, a tune he remembered from long nights on deployment when someone in his unit would play harmonica to break the monotony. The sound seemed to draw Hunter's attention. The dog lifted his head, watching Mark with that steady gaze. Then, without prompting, Hunter shuffled forward. One slow step, then another, until his front paws rested just inches from Mark's knee. Mark froze, not wanting to break the moment. He kept humming, eyes lowered, and after a long pause he felt the brush of Hunter's nose against his hand. It was a light touch, cautious but deliberate. "You're getting there, buddy," Mark said softly. That night, as Mark headed back to the house, he glanced over his shoulder. Hunter was still lying in his corner, but his head was up, ears forward, watching Mark go. There was something different in that look, not just wariness, but curiosity. It wasn't full trust yet, but it was a beginning. And beginnings, Mark knew, were worth holding on to. By the end of the week, the November winds had grown sharper in Pine Hollow. The barn doors rattled softly when a gust pushed through, and the smell of damp leaves drifted in from the fields. Mark had settled into a rhythm with Hunter mornings spent checking on him, afternoons repairing tools or chopping wood, evenings reading in the old armchair by the stall. Hunter still kept his distance most of the time, but now his eyes followed Mark with more curiosity than suspicion. That morning, Mark was tightening the loose hinge on the barn's side door. The rusty metal gave way suddenly, and the heavy toolbox he'd perched on a crate toppled to the ground with a loud metallic crash. In an instant, Hunter's ears snapped forward, his muscles tensing like coiled wire. He sprang to his feet and moved in a quick arc to stand between Mark and the source of the noise, head lowered, eyes scanning the space beyond the open door. It was the kind of movement that wasn't born from instinct alone. It had precision. Mark froze, taking in every detail. The way Hunter's paws planted evenly, his body weight balanced for movement in any direction, the stillness in his breathing. These were habits he'd seen in trained working dogs before. He crouched slightly, watching. After a moment, Mark tested a thought. In a calm but firm voice, he said, "Down." The reaction was immediate. Hunter dropped to the ground, chin flat, legs tucked neatly beneath him. There was no hesitation, no confusion, only compliance. Mark narrowed his eyes, his mind already piecing together a picture. "You've done this before." he murmured. Later that afternoon, when the clouds began to bruise purple along the horizon, Mark decided to test again. He picked up an old tennis ball from a box of odds and ends. Standing a few feet from Hunter, he pointed sharply and said, "Stay." He tossed the ball across the barn. Hunter didn't move. His eyes tracked the ball, but his body stayed locked in place. Only when Mark said, "Okay," did Hunter stand, cross the distance in a few strides, and return the ball, dropping it gently at Mark's feet. That night, after dinner, Mark picked up his phone and scrolled through the contacts list until he found a name he hadn't dialed in nearly a year: Tom Reyes. Tom had been a fellow Marine, shorter than Mark, but built like a steel beam, with close-cropped hair and a dry humor that could cut through any tense moment. After leaving active duty, Tom had joined a military canine training program and now worked as a consultant for law enforcement. When Tom answered, his voice was warm but tinged with surprise. "Mark Thompson. Thought you fell off the map." "Something like that," Mark replied. "Listen, I've got a dog here, German Shepherd. I picked him up at the flea market. He's got some skills, military kind of skills." "Like what?" Tom asked, his tone sharpening with interest. Mark described the reactions: the protective stance after the toolbox fell, the perfect down, the steady stay and retrieval. "Those aren't backyard tricks," Tom said after a pause. "That's muscle memory from serious training. If he's as sharp as you say, he's been through the program. Question is, which one?" Mark glanced over at Hunter, lying in the corner with his head resting on his paws but eyes fixed on him. "I don't know yet, but I intend to find out." The next day, Sarah stopped by again, this time with a thermos of soup and a knitted blanket she insisted was for the both of you. She noticed Hunter sitting near the barn door, ears twitching as her car pulled up. "He's watching like a guard," she said with a small smile. "More than that," Mark replied. "He's trained. Professional level." Sarah's brows lifted. "Well, that explains the way he moves, like he's thinking ahead of everyone else." Mark didn't elaborate. The thought of what Hunter might have been through before ending up here had lodged in his mind like a splinter. And if the dog's past was half as intense as his instincts suggested, then they had both walked through more than their share of fire. That evening, while closing up the barn, Mark decided on one last test. Standing in the doorway, he raised his hand into a flat palm and said, "Sit." Hunter's haunches lowered smoothly to the ground. Mark then turned his body halfway, curling his fingers in the air, a hand signal he'd seen military handlers use. Without a word, Hunter stood, circled once, and sat again on Mark's right side. It confirmed what he already suspected. Whoever had trained Hunter had done it with precision, discipline, and purpose. This was no accident. As the light faded and the barn filled with the low hum of night insects, Mark felt the faintest trace of a smile. "You're full of secrets, aren't you?" he said to the dog. Hunter didn't move, but his tail gave one slow, deliberate wag. The first frost of winter had crept over Pine Hollow, dusting the edges of the grass with silver and leaving the air thin and sharp. Mark had been restless all afternoon, unable to focus on the half-finished repairs to his porch. The hammer in his hand felt heavier than usual, his thoughts drifting back to the conversation with Tom Reyes and the questions that still lingered about Hunter's past. As the sky began to bruise into deep shades of violet, he grabbed his jacket and decided to walk the wooded trail behind his property. The path wound through the back acreage, weaving between maples and oaks stripped bare for the season. Hunter trotted alongside him, the dog's gait steady despite the slight limp. The woods were quiet except for the crunch of frost-hardened leaves under their steps and the occasional call of a crow heading home. Mark had always used these walks to settle his mind, but tonight the shadows between the trees seemed deeper, the silence heavier. A faint smell of smoke drifted through the air, likely from someone's distant fireplace, but it was enough to stir something in his memory. Without warning, the scent morphed in his mind into the acrid stench of burning fuel. His chest tightened. The trail beneath his feet blurred, replaced by a dusty road half a world away. The sharp pop of a branch snapping somewhere in the distance became, in his mind, the crack of small arms fire. His breath came faster, shallow, his vision narrowing. The cold air seemed suddenly thick, choking. He staggered to a stop, one hand gripping the rough bark of a tree, trying to orient himself. Hunter's reaction was immediate. The dog stepped in close, pressing the weight of his body firmly against Mark's leg. His head nudged at Mark's hand, grounding him in the present. When Mark dropped to his knees, Hunter moved with him, leaning harder, a steady, living anchor against the tide of panic. Mark's ears still rang with phantom echoes, but the warmth radiating from Hunter cut through the noise. The dog's breathing was slow, even, and without realizing it, Mark matched his own breaths to that rhythm. Inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale. The edges of the flashback began to fray, the imagined gunfire fading back into the distant rustle of winter branches. When Mark finally lifted his head, Hunter was watching him with a still, unwavering gaze. There was no fear in those amber eyes, only focus and quiet resolve, as if he understood exactly what had just happened and what was needed of him. A sudden crunch of footsteps approached from deeper along the trail. Mark turned his head sharply, adrenaline still raw, but the figure that emerged from the gloom was familiar. It was Carl Benton, a wiry man in his late 60s who lived on the adjoining property. Carl wore a battered leather hat and a faded green jacket that looked as though it had survived decades of hard use. He'd been a volunteer firefighter for most of his life before retiring, and though arthritis had bent his shoulders slightly, his eyes still carried the alertness of someone used to reading trouble from afar. "You all right there, Mark?" Carl asked, slowing his pace as he took in the scene. Mark forced a breath, nodding. "Yeah, just needed a minute." Carl's gaze shifted to Hunter, still pressed close to Mark's side. "That's a good dog you've got. Knows when to stick with you." Mark managed a small, tired smile. "Yeah, he knows." Carl gave a short nod, as if satisfied, and continued down the path toward his own property. Hunter stayed close until Mark rose to his feet, and even then he walked at his side without straying. The rest of the way home was quiet, but this time the silence felt steady, not suffocating. Back at the barn, Mark crouched in front of Hunter, resting one hand on the dog's shoulder. "You're more than just a fighter, aren't you?" His voice was low, almost to himself. "You've been trained for this, for me." Hunter didn't move, but his tail brushed once against the blanket behind him, a small motion that felt like agreement. That night, Mark sat in the armchair longer than usual, book forgotten in his lap, the barn light casting a soft glow over them both. Something had shifted. He'd always known Hunter was skilled, but tonight had shown him another side, one that didn't just protect against danger, but could pull a man back from the edge. The morning after their walk in the woods, the air in Pine Hollow carried the brittle edge of approaching snow. Mark noticed Hunter still favoring his left hind leg more than usual. It wasn't the limp of fatigue. It was sharper, the kind of movement that spoke of a deeper injury that had never fully healed. Mark decided it was time to have him checked properly. He pulled on his heavy coat, grabbed the truck keys, and called the vet's office in town. The Pine Hollow Veterinary Clinic was a small brick building tucked between the feed store and a bakery that always smelled of fresh cinnamon rolls. Inside, the space was warm and bright, with the soft hum of a heater and faint country music playing from a radio on the counter. Behind the desk stood a woman in her early 40s, slender with neat auburn hair pulled into a ponytail. Her name tag read Marla. She had the calm efficiency of someone used to managing anxious pet owners and their animals. "Morning, Mark. What can we do for you?" "Hunter, here's got an old injury," Mark said, glancing down at the dog. "Figured it's time someone took a real look." Marla nodded and picked up the phone to let the vet know. Within minutes, Dr. Benjamin Simmons stepped into the waiting area. Simmons was in his late 50s, tall, with a slight stoop from years bent over examining tables. His salt and pepper beard gave him a scholarly air, and his eyes were the kind that seemed to notice everything without judgment. "Good to see you, Mark," Simmons said, shaking his hand firmly before crouching to greet Hunter. "Let's take him in and have a look." In the exam room, Simmons moved with quiet precision, his hands gentle but thorough as he checked Hunter's leg, joints, and muscles. He hummed softly as he worked, the way some people do when concentrating. "Old injury," he murmured. "Could be from blunt force or shrapnel. Hard to say without an X-ray." When his hands moved to the dog's neck and shoulders, Simmons paused. His brow furrowed as he pressed lightly against a small, hard spot under the skin just behind Hunter's left shoulder. "There's something here," he said. "Feels like a microchip, but damaged. Let's see if we can read it." He pulled a handheld scanner from the counter and passed it over the area. At first, nothing happened. Simmons adjusted the angle, tried again, and this time the scanner emitted a faint beep. The display flickered, then stabilized. Simmons' eyes widened. "Well, this is something." He turned the screen toward Mark. "Your Hunter here isn't just any dog. He's registered as Echo 7, U.S. Military Canine. Status, missing in action Syria, 3 years ago." Mark stared at the screen, his mind reeling. "Missing in action?" Simmons nodded gravely. "The record says he was part of a convoy escort detail. There was an IED explosion during a humanitarian transport in northern Syria. Several vehicles destroyed. Echo 7's handler was injured and evacuated. The dog was reported unaccounted for, presumed dead." Mark's gaze shifted to Hunter, who stood calmly between them, tail still and ears forward, as though the words meant nothing to him. "How does a dog go from a war zone to a flea market in Pine Hollow?" Mark asked. Simmons leaned back, folding his arms. "Best guess? He might have been found by locals. Sometimes military dogs are cared for by civilians if they can't be returned. If he was injured, they may not have had the means for proper care. From there, it's not uncommon for animals to be traded or sold, especially through less than official channels. Eventually, he could have been moved across borders, ended up with someone who brought him to the U.S. through a rescue network or even private sale." Mark thought about the limp, the torn ear, the steady, unflinching eyes. "And the chip?" "Likely damaged in the explosion," Simmons replied. "It wouldn't have been able to transmit properly. Without a scan in just the right way, it's almost invisible. That's probably why no one connected him to his old records until now." Mark stood in silence for a moment, the truth settling in. The military stance, the flawless obedience, the unshakable calm in dangerous situations, it all made sense now. Hunter wasn't just a survivor. He was a decorated working dog, a soldier in his own right. Simmons, seeing the weight of it on Mark's face, softened his tone. "Whatever happened out there, he's here now. And from the looks of it, he's chosen you." Mark glanced down at Hunter, who met his gaze without blinking. There was no need for words, both of them understood. They'd found each other after walking their own separate, brutal roads, and neither intended to let go. On the way out, Marla handed Mark a small envelope with Hunter's medical report. "You've got yourself a hero," she said with a smile. Mark didn't reply immediately. He just rested his hand on Hunter's back, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breath. Hero wasn't the word he would have chosen, but he knew she wasn't wrong. The rain had been falling since dawn, a cold, steady drizzle that turned the dirt roads of Pine Hollow into slick ribbons of mud. By late afternoon, the temperature had dropped further, and a thin mist clung low over the fields. In the barn, the rhythmic sound of rain on the tin roof was almost hypnotic. Mark sat on a stool, running a cloth over the metal parts of an old rifle, while Hunter lay curled on his blanket, ears twitching occasionally at the louder gusts of wind. The sound of tires crunching over wet gravel broke the quiet. Mark stood and stepped to the barn door just as Carl Benton's old Chevy truck came to a stop. Carl climbed out quickly, pulling his battered leather hat lower over his brow. Even in the dim light, Mark could see the tight lines of worry etched into the older man's weathered face. "Mark," Carl called over, his voice urgent. "Have you seen Mrs. Wilkins today?" Mark shook his head. "No, not since last week. What's going on?" Carl walked closer, rain dripping from his hat brim. "Her nephew came by to check on her this afternoon. Found her house unlocked, her coat and boots gone. She's nowhere in sight. Sheriff's deputies have been combing the woods for hours, but they've had to pull back visibilities bad, and the ground's turning nasty." Mrs. Wilkins. Mark knew her only in passing, but enough to picture her, a slight woman with fine white hair, always neatly pinned back, eyes that crinkled kindly when she smiled. She was 78, proud to a fault, and had lived alone at the edge of Mill Road for nearly 2 decades. He also knew that a night out in this weather could be lethal for someone her age. Mark looked down at Hunter. The dog had risen silently, standing at his side, tail low but ears pricked forward. It wasn't just curiosity in his posture, it was readiness. "Carl," Mark said, "let's see if Hunter can find her." Within minutes, they were at the back edge of Mrs. Wilkins' property, where a narrow trail disappeared into the trees. The rain fell harder here, dripping in steady streams from the bare branches overhead. A deputy in a yellow rain slicker met them at the trailhead, her flashlight beam cutting through the gray. Her name tag read Collins. "You're Mark Thompson, right?" she asked. "Carl says your dog's got training." Mark gave a curt nod. "Military level. He can track if he's got a scent." Collins handed him a knitted scarf. "This was hanging by her kitchen door. Should be recent." Mark crouched and held the scarf to Hunter's nose. The shepherd inhaled deeply, his nostrils flaring, then looked up at Mark as if to say, "I've got it." Without hesitation, he lowered his head and began to move forward, pulling slightly against the lead. They followed him into the trees, their boots sinking into the sodden ground. The rain muffled most sounds, leaving only the swish of wet branches and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. The main trail soon veered left, but Hunter ignored it, angling sharply right toward denser undergrowth. Carl shot Mark a look. "You sure about this?" "Trust him," Mark replied. The forest floor sloped upward, the mud making every step a fight for balance. Twice, Carl nearly lost his footing, steadying himself against a tree trunk. Hunter never faltered, moving in a zigzag pattern, nose close to the ground, tail flicking as he worked. At one point, he paused, sniffing at a cluster of broken branches before surging forward again. 15 minutes in, the wind picked up, bending the tree limbs overhead. Mark could feel the damp seeping through his jacket, chilling him to the bone. They crossed a shallow gully where water gurgled over slick stones. On the far side, Hunter stopped abruptly, ears swiveling. He glanced back at Mark, then moved with sudden urgency down a narrow animal path. The ground leveled out into a small hollow, ringed by leaning cedar trees. And there, half hidden in the shadow of one sat Mrs. Wilkins. She was hunched against the trunk, her raincoat soaked through, her thin legs pulled up beneath her. Her face was pale, lips tinged with blue. Mark was beside her in seconds, stripping off his jacket to drape over her shoulders. "Mrs. Wilkins, it's Mark. You're safe now. We're getting you home." Her cloudy eyes blinked up at him, confusion giving way to faint relief. "I got turned around. I didn't know which way. And then it got so cold." Hunter stood close, pressing his side against her legs as if to lend warmth. She reached out a trembling hand, and he dipped his head just enough for her fingers to thread into his fur. Carl's voice was calm but firm as he radioed Collins with their location. "We've got her. Send the deputies in with the stretcher ground slippery. She's not walking out on her own." While they waited, Mark stayed crouched beside her, keeping his arm around her shoulders. Hunter never moved from his spot, his gaze scanning the trees as though guarding them from any further harm. When the deputies arrived, they worked quickly, wrapping Mrs. Wilkins in a thermal blanket before lifting her onto the stretcher. As they began the careful trek back to the trailhead, Hunter trotted alongside, occasionally glancing back at Mark as if to check that he was keeping pace. By the time they reached the clearing, the rain had softened to a mist. Mrs. Wilkins was loaded gently into the back of the waiting ambulance, her hand briefly brushing Hunter's head in a silent thank you. Deputy Collins turned to Mark, rainwater dripping from the brim of her hood. "We owe your dog a lot tonight. The rest of us were looking in the wrong place." He went straight to her. Mark glanced down at Hunter, who shook the rain from his coat, eyes half closed in that quiet, self-contained way of his. "That's what he does," Mark said simply. The rain from the night of the rescue had long since passed, leaving the air in Pine Hollow bright and clear, the kind of crisp winter sunlight that made the frost sparkle on rooftops. It had been 3 days since Hunter found Mrs. Wilkins, and the story had already traveled faster than the cold wind through town. Mark noticed the change almost immediately. On his first trip into town after the rescue, he stopped by the hardware store for nails and paint. Normally, people glanced his way and quickly looked off, respecting the quiet bubble he seemed to keep around himself. But this time, folks approached. An older man in a wool cap clapped him on the shoulder. A mother with 2 children thanked him for what you and that dog did. Even strangers who didn't know his name had started nodding as he passed. By the time Mark returned to his truck, Hunter, waiting patiently in the passenger seat, had a small paper bag of treats from the store owner, a wiry man named Pete who had a reputation for being gruff. "For your partner," Pete had said, his voice grumbling but his eyes soft. That afternoon, Sarah Johnson arrived at Mark's place carrying a basket lined with a checkered cloth. She was dressed in her usual winter uniform, a long wool coat, knitted scarf, and leather gloves that looked older than some of the townsfolk. Her sharp blue eyes scanned the barn before settling on Hunter. "Well, aren't you the talk of Pine Hollow?" she said, crouching to scratch behind Hunter's ears. "You've got people who never agree on anything agreeing about you." She handed Mark the basket. Inside were fresh biscuits, a jar of homemade apple butter, and a loaf of bread still warm from the oven. "I'm not much for attention," Mark admitted. Sarah smiled knowingly. "Maybe. But sometimes the right kind of attention can do more than you think." Later that week, an invitation arrived in the mail, the envelope bearing the logo of the Pine Hollow Veterans Association. Inside was a handwritten note from their chairperson, a stocky man named Frank Myers. Frank was in his early 60s, his hair a steel gray crew cut, and he carried himself with the easy confidence of someone who'd led men in difficult places. "Mark," the note read, "we'd be honored if you and your dog could join us at the community hall this Saturday. The guys would like to meet you both, and I think you'll find it's good to be around people who speak the same language." At first, Mark almost tossed it aside. Crowds weren't his thing, and gatherings had been harder for him since coming home. But when Saturday came, he found himself standing outside the hall, Hunter at his side, the murmur of voices spilling from the open doors. Inside, the warm scent of coffee and chili greeted them. Long tables were arranged with photos of service members, flags folded neatly in triangular cases, and worn medals in display boxes. The veterans ranged in age from fresh-faced 20-somethings to men and women with hair as white as the snow outside. Frank spotted them immediately and came over, his handshake firm. "Good to finally meet you, Mark. And you must be Hunter." He gave the dog a nod that was more like a salute. They moved through the room slowly, and Mark was surprised at how easily conversations started. Some wanted to hear about the rescue. Others just wanted to talk dogs. A Vietnam veteran with a quiet demeanor told Mark about the shepherd he'd served with in 1969. A younger Marine laughed about how his unit's bomb-sniffing dog once stole an officer's sandwich during an inspection. Hunter stayed calm and steady throughout, letting hands ruffle his fur, sitting obediently when told. At one point, a boy of about 10, there with his grandfather, knelt to hug Hunter, his face lighting up as the dog rested his head gently on the boy's shoulder. Mark felt something shift. The walls he'd kept around himself weren't gone, but they were thinner. He realized that every smile, every handshake, every shared story was another step toward a life he'd stopped believing he could have. And Hunter was the reason he was taking those steps. By the time they left, the winter sky was already turning the color of pale steel, the first stars blinking through. As they walked to the truck, Mark looked down at Hunter. "You did more than save Mrs. Wilkins," he said quietly. "You're saving me too." Hunter looked up at him briefly, tail giving a slow wag, as if he understood. The first snow of the season had fallen overnight, laying a clean white blanket across Pine Hollow. Sunlight glinted off the rooftops and made the air sparkle, but the cold was sharp, nipping at exposed skin. Mark stood outside the town hall, his breath puffing in white clouds. Beside him, Hunter sat tall and steady, his black and tan coat vivid against the snow, amber eyes scanning the crowd gathering near the entrance. Inside, the hall was already buzzing with voices. Flags hung along the walls, and a long table at the front was draped in dark blue cloth embroidered with the seal of the Pine Hollow Veterans Association. Rows of folding chairs filled the room, and the smell of fresh coffee mingled with pine from the wreaths hung for the holidays. Frank Myers, the association chair, approached from the stage. His steel-gray hair was neatly combed, and he wore a blazer that couldn't quite hide the broad-shouldered frame of a man who had spent decades in uniform. "Good turnout today," he said with a grin. "You ready?" Mark gave a small nod. "As I'll ever be." When the ceremony began, Frank stepped to the microphone. His voice carried easily over the room. "Today, we honor not just our veterans, but those who continue to serve in ways that go beyond the battlefield. Some of you know the story of a certain German shepherd and the Marine he chose to stand beside, but today, we're going to hear it from the man himself." Applause filled the room as Frank motioned for Mark to join him. Mark walked to the podium, Hunter moving at his side with perfect heel work. The lights above made the polished wood floor gleam. Mark rested his hands lightly on the podium, scanning the audience. He saw Sarah in the second row, her tall frame upright, scarf wrapped neatly around her neck, eyes bright with encouragement. Carl sat beside her, hat in his lap, his weathered face split into a rare, proud smile. Even Mrs. Wilkins was there, wrapped in a thick coat, her hands folded around a small thermos of tea. Mark cleared his throat. "When I first saw Hunter, he was tied to a post at a flea market. The man selling him said he wasn't worth much anymore. $10, that was it." His voice softened. "I didn't know who he was. I didn't know what he'd been through. I just knew. He needed someone, and maybe I did too." He glanced down at Hunter, who looked back with that calm, steady gaze. "People have told me I saved him, but the truth is, Hunter saved me first. He's been there through the roughest nights, the quietest mornings, the moments I thought I'd never get back up. He's pulled me out of more than one place I didn't think I could escape." There was a stillness in the room now, the kind that meant every ear was listening. "I've registered him as my official service dog, not because he needed the title, but because it means we can keep doing what we've already been doing, helping others. Hunter and I will be working with the Veterans Association, supporting those who are still fighting battles no one can see." He let the words settle before adding, "He's not just my partner, he's my family, and I can promise you this, wherever I go, he goes. That's our deal, that's our vow." Applause erupted, rising until it filled the hall. Frank returned to the stage, presenting Mark and Hunter with a framed certificate and a collar tag engraved with the association's emblem. Hunter stood patiently as Mark fastened it to his collar, the metal glinting in the light. After the ceremony, people lined up to shake Mark's hand or kneel to greet Hunter. A young woman with a prosthetic leg army patch on her jacket spent several minutes with the dog, smiling for the first time in what looked like a long while. An older veteran told Mark, "You've got a once-in-a-lifetime dog there. Take care of each other." When the crowd began to thin, Mark and Hunter stepped outside into the cold. Snowflakes drifted lazily down, melting against Hunter's fur. Mark crouched beside him, resting a gloved hand on his neck. "We got work to do, partner," he murmured. Hunter's tail swept slowly through the snow, as if in agreement. They walked off together, their footprints side by side in the untouched white, a man and his dog bound by a promise stronger than words. Sometimes God's greatest miracles don't come with thunder or blinding light. They walk quietly into our lives on four legs, carrying the kind of love that heals wounds we thought would never close. Hunter was more than a dog to Mark. He was a proof that broken things can be made whole again, that second chances are real, and that God places the right souls in our path exactly when we need them most. In our everyday lives, we may pass by someone or something that needs us just as much as we need them. Don't ignore those moments. They might be your miracle in disguise. If this story touched your heart, please share it so others can feel the same hope. Leave a comment below and type Amen if you believe God still works miracles through the bonds of love and loyalty. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that remind us we are never truly alone. May God bless you and protect you always.